The morning I sat down in courtroom 14 on the fourth floor of Suffolk County Superior Court in Boston, Massachusetts, I was wearing the same gray suit I wore to my grandfather's funeral. Not because I was being dramatic, because I wanted to remember exactly what I was fighting for. Sabrina was already seated at the plaintiff's table when I walked in. She had her hair done the way she only ever does it when she wants to make an impression. Loose waves, expensive highlights, the kind of effort that takes 2 hours and is supposed to look effortless. Her attorney, a man named Preston Gallagher, was leaning in close, whispering something. Sabrina laughed at whatever it was, then looked up and saw me. She rolled her eyes. Actual, theatrical, deliberate eye roll. The kind that says you're still not worth my serious attention. I sat down beside my attorney, Margaret Ewan, and I said nothing. It was what happened 30 seconds later that I want you to remember. The Honorable Judge David Fairfield took his seat, organized his papers, looked down at the case file in front of him. He read for about 10 seconds. Then he looked up, looked at Sabrina's table, then looked at mine, then looked back at his papers. He said, and I want to quote this exactly, "Counsel, I'm confused. Are these charges filed against Mr. Hartwell? Or is Mr. Hartwell the respondent in a counteraction?" Preston Gallagher stood up confidently. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Hartwell, is the plaintiff in this action. We're seeking equitable distribution of—" "I understand the motion," Judge Fairfield said, cutting him off. He looked at me again, then back down at the folder. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to make sure I'm reading this correctly. The charges of financial misconduct, asset concealment, and fraud, those are against you?" Margaret Ewan spoke first. "They were, Your Honor. We'll be addressing each of those claims momentarily. But perhaps more relevant to this morning is the counterfiling my client submitted on Monday." Sabrina's smile hadn't moved, but Preston Gallagher's had. Judge Fairfield leaned back in his chair. "Yes, I see that." He looked at Sabrina, then at her attorney. "I want to make absolutely certain everyone in this room understands what they walked into today." They didn't. That was the whole point. Let me start from the beginning, because if I don't, you won't understand why I don't regret a single thing about what happened in that courtroom. Not 1 second of it. My name is Julian Hartwell. I'm 43 years old. I'm the chief technical officer of a mid-sized cybersecurity firm called Vantage Systems, headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, about 4 miles from downtown Boston. We have 61 employees, a federal contract with the Department of Defense, and a reputation in our industry that I spent 14 years building, one painstaking decision at a time. Before any of that, though, I was just my grandfather's grandson. My grandfather, Raymond Whitfield Hartwell, was 81 years old when he died on a Thursday morning in late October, in the bedroom of his house in Weston, Massachusetts, a town about 16 miles west of the city, where the homes have long driveways, and the old money is quiet about itself. He'd lived in that house for 43 years. He'd built his first company, an industrial supply business, out of a garage in Framingham in 1971. By the time I was born, he was already wealthy. By the time I was old enough to understand what wealth meant, he was the kind of wealthy that people whisper about at funerals. I want to tell you who my grandfather was before I tell you what happened with Sabrina, because the two things are connected in ways that are going to matter. Raymond Hartwell was not a man who spent money on showing people he had money. He drove a 12-year-old Volvo. He wore flannel shirts from LL Bean. He grew tomatoes every summer in a raised bed he'd built himself behind the house and brought them to neighbors in brown paper bags. He went to the same barber in Weston for 30 years, a man named Earl, and when Earl retired, my grandfather cried. Actual tears, standing on the sidewalk in front of the barber shop. He was the most genuine human being I have ever known. He was also, quietly and without fanfare, worth approximately $47 million. Most people who knew my grandfather didn't know the number. He didn't broadcast it. He didn't live to the number. He lived like a man who'd worked his whole life with his hands and happened to have ended up somewhere unexpected. He gave money away steadily and privately, to churches, to community organizations, to individual people who needed it and would never know where it came from. His accountant once told me that tracking his charitable giving was like trying to document rainfall. It was constant, and it came from everywhere. He and I had a particular closeness. My father, his son, was an attorney who'd spent most of my childhood in his office or on planes, and my mother was a woman who tried her best, but was constitutionally overwhelmed by most things. My grandfather was the steady one, the one who showed up. He came to my science fairs. He sat in the cold at my high school track meets. When I got into MIT for computer science, he drove to Cambridge with me and helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and then took me to dinner at a diner on Mass Avenue where we ate pie for an hour, and he told me stories about the first time he ever negotiated a business deal. He was my person. Simple as that. I married Sabrina Kellner when I was 36 and she was 32. We'd met through mutual friends at an industry event in the Seaport District. She worked in corporate event planning and she was at the event in a professional capacity, and I was there because one of our investors had insisted on it. She was sharp and funny, and she laughed at things that were actually funny rather than things that were supposed to be funny, which I'd always found rare. We dated for 2 years, and I thought I knew who she was. My grandfather met her 3 times before we got married. Each time afterward, he was courteous and kind to me about it. He didn't say much. He asked how things were going. He asked if I was happy. He told me that I was a good judge of character in my professional life, and he hoped I was applying the same standards to my personal one. I thought he was just being a grandfather. I didn't understand what he was trying to tell me until much later. The marriage was fine for the first 4 years. Not spectacular. Not the deep partnership I'd imagined when I said my vows at the ceremony in Brookline, but functional. Sabrina was good at the life we built together. We had a brownstone on Kamav. We traveled twice a year. We had dinner parties with people from both our industries. She had her work, I had mine. We coexisted with warmth and regular periods of genuine connection. Then, the business started doing well. Very well. When Vantage Systems landed the federal contract in year 5 of our marriage, everything changed. The money that came with it changed the scale of what we were doing. We hired fast. We expanded. I was in DC every other week. I was in San Francisco. I was in Brussels. Twice in a single quarter. I was everywhere except, eventually, my own home. I want to be honest about that part. I have examined the years of my marriage with as much honesty as I can manage. And I don't think I was a bad husband, but I was an absent one. I got wrapped up in building something and I told myself the life we had was sustainable on the terms we'd set. I told myself Sabrina understood what this phase of a business required. I told myself the dinners we had on the nights I was home and the trips we took in January and July were enough to maintain what we'd built between us as 2 people. I was not paying close enough attention, and by the time I started noticing the signs, the damage was already done. The signs looked like small things in isolation. Sabrina had always been warm when I came home from a trip, interested, engaged, asking about what I'd been doing. Somewhere in the latter part of year 4 and into year 5, that warmth became something more performative. She asked the questions, but she wasn't waiting for the answers. She was present at dinner, but the presence had a quality of maintenance to it, like someone running through a checklist. She started going to the gym at odd hours. She started keeping her phone face down on the kitchen counter in a way she hadn't before. I noticed all of this. I cataloged it without acting on it, which is what I do. I observe and I wait until I have enough information to form a picture. The picture came into focus on a Tuesday evening in late March. His name was Derek Caulfield. He was 39, a financial consultant at a firm in the financial district, someone Sabrina had met at a client event she'd organized at a hotel in the Back Bay. I didn't know about him for 3 months. I found out the way most people find out. Not through surveillance, not through a private investigator, but through a moment of accidental visibility. I came home from a DC trip a day early because my flight had been moved up to accommodate a rescheduled meeting, and I heard her on the phone in the kitchen, and I stood in the hallway for about 30 seconds. The tone of her voice, the specific softness of it, the way she laughed at something quietly, like the laugh was meant only for one person. 30 seconds was enough. I didn't say anything that night. I set down my bag by the door, made a noise so she'd know I was home, and waited. She appeared from the kitchen 30 seconds later. 30 seconds, you'll notice, is a very specific unit of time, with a smile that was precisely 3% warmer than it needed to be. We cooked dinner together, or rather she cooked, and I stood at the counter and handed her things, the way we'd always done it. We ate. She talked about her week, a client whose venue had double booked, a vendor who'd sent the wrong linens for an event at the Mandarin Oriental. I listened. I asked follow-up questions in the right places. I slept 6 hours and woke up at 4:45 in the morning with the particular clarity that comes after your body processes a shock it hasn't quite transmitted to your conscious mind yet. That cold water clear feeling where everything looks very precise, and the path forward announces itself without drama. I need you to understand something about me. I am not a man who makes fast moves in a crisis. I work in cybersecurity. My entire professional life is built on the principle that information is only useful when it's complete, that you don't respond to an incident until you understand its full scope. I applied the same principle to my marriage. I spent 6 weeks gathering information. Not because I was looking to destroy Sabrina, though I understand why that sounds naive given what came later, but because I needed to understand the shape of the situation before I could decide what to do about it. I spoke to an attorney. I organized my financial documentation. I made sure I understood what I was looking at. What I found, in those 6 weeks, was more than an affair. Sabrina had, over the course of the previous 14 months, transferred approximately $230,000 out of our joint account and into an account I didn't know existed. Small amounts, irregular timing, the pattern of someone who understood that consistent transfers get flagged. She wasn't unsophisticated about it. She moved money before depositing new funds, timed it to blur against legitimate household expenses. It was patient and methodical, and it told me that this had been planned for a long time. I have been in rooms where multi-million-dollar federal contracts were on the line. I have testified before congressional subcommittees about cybersecurity vulnerabilities. I have sat across the table from people who were actively trying to deceive me, while I was actively trying to understand what they were hiding. Nothing I have ever done professionally prepared me for what it felt like to sit across the dinner table from my wife and understand that she had been managing me like an asset. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. My attorney, Margaret Ewan, had it served to Sabrina at her office in the Prudential Center at 10:15 a.m. I was in a meeting with our DoD liaison when it happened. I know the exact time because Margaret texted me. Papers served. Her attorney will make contact before end of business. I finished the meeting. Then I drove to Weston. My grandfather was in his study when I got there, sitting in the leather chair that had been in that room since before I was born, reading a book about the railroads of 19th century New England. He was wearing his flannel shirt, and his reading glasses were pushed down his nose the way they always were when he was deep into something. I sat down across from him, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He had always been one of the best listeners I'd ever known, the kind of listener who makes you feel that what you're saying is the only thing happening in the world. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want you to hear something, Julian. The fact that you built something worth stealing from says more about you than the theft says about her." Then he took off his glasses, folded them, and put them on the side table. "I've been thinking about some things," he said. "I'd like to sit with my attorney this week. You should probably know that before things get complicated." I didn't ask what he meant. With my grandfather, you learned to let information arrive at the pace he intended it. He died 7 weeks later. Peacefully, in his own bed, in his own house, the way he'd always said he wanted to. The will reading was on a Monday in December, in the offices of his attorney, Thomas Connolly on Newbury Street. My father was there. My aunt and her husband. A cousin I'd seen twice in the last decade. And me. The house went to a preservation trust, with instructions that it be maintained as a private residence rather than developed. His vehicle went to his nephew. A scholarship fund he'd established at UMass Boston received an endowment. Several individuals received specific bequests, people I didn't know, who I later learned were people he'd helped quietly over the years. The business interests, the investment portfolio, the liquid assets, approximately $44 million in total, were left entirely to me. My father, to his credit, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He told me last year he was going to do this. I just didn't entirely believe it." My aunt asked for a copy of the document. I drove home in silence, sat in the parking garage under my building for about 20 minutes, and then called Margaret Ewan. Sabrina found out about the inheritance before I told her. I don't know how. The most likely explanation is that someone at Connolly's office mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone. Boston is a smaller city than people think when it comes to the circles where lawyers and money intersect. She called me the morning after the will reading. The divorce proceedings were already underway. We were past the point of having the kind of conversations that begin with "we need to talk." But that's exactly how she opened the call. "I know about the inheritance," she said. I said, I know you do. I think we should reconsider the divorce proceedings in light of everything. I want to give you the real version of what she said, because the sanitized version doesn't capture what it actually was. She spoke for about 3 minutes. She talked about the years we'd built together, about partnership, about how she'd supported my career through its difficult early stages. She talked about how the inheritance changed the calculus of what was fair. She used the word equitable twice. She did not mention Derek Caulfield once. When she finished, I said, I'll let Margaret know you called. She hung up. The lawsuit came 12 days later. It was, on its surface, a petition for equitable distribution of marital assets. Not unusual in a divorce proceeding, and not in itself extraordinary. But Sabrina's attorney, Preston Gallagher, had built the filing around a set of claims that were, I'll be blunt, they were fabrications. The core allegation was that I had engaged in financial misconduct during the marriage, specifically that I had concealed assets, that I had structured compensation from Vantage Systems in ways designed to minimize her claim in the divorce, and that I had exerted undue influence over my grandfather in the months before his death to ensure I was named his primary heir. That last one. I want to sit with that one for a moment. The suggestion that I had manipulated an 81-year-old man, a man who had spent 60 years building his own judgment, who had looked at situations with more clarity than anyone I've ever known, who had told me to my face that he'd been thinking about updating his estate planning the same evening I told him about the divorce. The suggestion that I had manufactured that outcome was the thing that made me understand that there were no limits to what Sabrina was willing to claim. Margaret Ewan's response when I called her was measured and professional. Okay, she said, let's build the counterfiling. If you've been watching for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe and hit that like button. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you. Genuinely. Now let's keep going. What Sabrina didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because I hadn't told her, because it wasn't relevant to our marriage while we were in it, was what I actually did at Vantage Systems. CTO is the title. The reality is more complicated. When I co-founded Vantage 8 years ago with my business partner, Nate Elgin, we structured the company in a specific way. Nate holds the CEO title and manages client relationships and external-facing operations. I run everything technical, everything operational, and I hold the majority share position in the company. 54%. The federal contract, which now represents the largest single revenue stream in our business, exists because of a technical architecture I personally designed and proposed in a competitive bid process. Sabrina had been present at enough company dinners and events to know that Vantage was doing well. She did not know the specifics of my equity position. She did not know what the company was worth. More importantly, she did not know about the arrangement my grandfather and I had discussed the night I sat with him in his study. 6 weeks before he died, Raymond Hartwell had revised his estate documentation with Thomas Connolly. Those revisions had been made knowing that my marriage was ending, knowing that the financial landscape of my life was about to become complicated, and knowing, with the quiet foresight my grandfather applied to everything, that what he was leaving me might become a target. The documents Thomas Connolly had drawn up included something called a discretionary trust provision, a structure that, under Massachusetts law, protected the inherited assets from being classified as marital property subject to equitable distribution. The assets my grandfather left me were placed in a trust of which I was the sole beneficiary, structured in a way that gave me access and control while placing them clearly outside the reach of a divorce proceeding. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. He had been 3 steps ahead of a situation that hadn't fully materialized yet. That was who he was. The counter-filing Margaret Ewan submitted to Suffolk County Superior Court on the Monday before the hearing didn't just respond to Sabrina's claims. It addressed each one directly with documentation. The financial misconduct claims, dismantled entirely by 4 years of audited company financials, reviewed and signed by an independent accounting firm. The asset concealment claim, addressed with full disclosure of the trust structure and the legal basis for its classification under Massachusetts probate law. The undue influence claim, answered with sworn testimony from Thomas Connolly, a certified copy of the revised estate documents dated 6 weeks before my grandfather's death, and a letter my grandfather had written to be included in his estate files. A letter in which he explained, in his own handwriting, in complete sentences, that his decision to leave his estate to me was made with full cognizance, without pressure from any person, and after decades of careful consideration of who in his family had shown the values he wanted his legacy to support. He had written that letter knowing it might be needed someday. I thought about that letter for a long time. There was one more piece. The piece that Preston Gallagher hadn't seen coming and hadn't thought to guard against. The $230,000. When I'd discovered the transfers during those 6 weeks of documentation before filing for divorce, I had not immediately acted on the information. I had preserved it, cataloged it, had a forensic accountant review and certify the records. And then I had let the divorce process begin without mentioning it, because Margaret Ewan had advised, correctly, that the moment to use that information was not when I was trying to extricate myself from the marriage, but if and when the other side escalated. Sabrina's lawsuit was the escalation. The counter-filing included as an exhibit the complete forensic accounting of the transfers, dates, amounts, destination account, and the documentation connecting that account to Sabrina's personal control. It included a certified analysis from the forensic accountant, and it included a referral request to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for Criminal Review. $230,000, moved methodically and deliberately over 14 months, from a joint marital account without my knowledge. That's not a divorce proceeding. That's a crime. I want to tell you about the morning of the hearing. I woke up early, 4:53 a.m., lay there for a few minutes, then got up and made coffee and stood at the window in my kitchen looking at Calm Ave in the dark. The street was empty, except for a delivery truck working its way down the block. Boston in early morning has a particular quiet, the kind of city silence that isn't really silence, just the sounds lowered to a manageable register. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the flannel shirts and the Volvo and the tomatoes in paper bags. I thought about the diner on Mass Avenue where we ate pie and he told me stories. I thought about the last time I sat with him in his study, and the way he'd said I've been thinking about some things with that particular calm that meant he'd already decided. I thought about the letter he'd written to be placed in his estate file, the letter that said he'd chosen me because of what I'd shown him about my values, about who I was. I had a responsibility to be the person my grandfather thought I was. I put on the gray suit and drove to Copley. The courtroom. Let me take you back inside. Judge Fairfield had spent about 45 seconds reading the counterfiling after Margaret's mention of it. During those 45 seconds, Preston Gallagher sat very still. Sabrina sat with her back straight and her hands folded, and I watched her because I wanted to see the exact moment she understood. "Counsel," Judge Fairfield said, looking at Preston Gallagher, "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. Your client has filed a claim of financial misconduct and asset concealment against Mr. Hartwell. And Mr. Hartwell's counterfiling includes a forensic accounting review and a referral to the DA's office related to, let me find the right language here, alleged systematic unauthorized transfer of joint marital funds." "Your Honor," Gallagher began. "Let me finish." Judge Fairfield looked at the documents again. "The amounts documented are significant. The period of documentation is 14 months, and the referral has already been submitted." He looked up. "Was your client aware of the forensic accounting before this filing?" There was a pause. "My client maintains—" "I didn't ask what your client maintains. I asked whether she was aware." The pause this time was longer. Sabrina leaned over and whispered something to Gallagher. He listened, then looked back at the judge. "We were not aware of the specifics of the counter-filing prior to receipt." "Then I would strongly suggest," Judge Fairfield said, "that your client and her counsel take a recess to review what's been submitted before we proceed with any of the plaintiff's claims. Because what I'm looking at significantly changes the nature of this proceeding." He looked at me for a moment. I held his gaze and said nothing. "Mr. Hartwell," he said quietly, "I see that you've also submitted a petition for full recovery of the transferred funds, with interest, as part of the divorce settlement. Is that correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor." He nodded. "All right, we'll take a 30-minute recess." 30 minutes is a specific amount of time, Not long enough to make a plan. Long enough to understand the shape of what's in front of you. I spent it in the corridor outside the courtroom with Margaret. She was calm, the way she is always calm, which is something I'd paid a great deal of attention to when I was choosing her. "How do you think they'll move?" I asked. "Gallagher is a smart attorney," she said. "He won't push the original claims today. He'll ask for a continuance to review, which the judge will grant. But the criminal referral doesn't pause for a civil continuance. That's already in process." What happens with the trust? The trust provision is airtight under Massachusetts law. Inherited assets in a discretionary trust structure aren't subject to equitable distribution. Your grandfather's attorney executed it correctly. There's nothing for her to reach. I looked out the window at the end of the corridor. Boston in late morning, gray November sky over the low buildings of the South. End. "She's going to try to fight the criminal referral," I said. It wasn't a question. "She'll try. Whether she succeeds depends on what the DA's office decides to do with what we submitted." Margaret paused. "But Julian, the documentation is very clean. The forensic accountant's report is very thorough. You were careful." "I had a good teacher," I said. She looked at me. "Your grandfather?" "He spent 40 years building things carefully. You don't get to $47 million by being sloppy." She almost smiled. When we went back into the courtroom, Preston Gallagher stood up and asked for a 60-day continuance to review the counterfiling materials. Judge Fairfield granted 30. Then something happened that I hadn't anticipated and that I'll remember for a long time. Judge Fairfield looked at Gallagher and said, "Counselor, I want to be very direct with you about something. The claims in your original filing are serious claims. Undue influence on a decedent in the formation of an estate is a significant allegation. Before you proceed with those claims at the continued hearing, I want you to have reviewed everything your opposing counsel has submitted, and I mean everything. And I want you to be prepared to defend the basis of each claim with specificity, because I will be asking." He paused. "I have no interest in this court being used as a mechanism for harassment in a divorce proceeding. I think you understand what I mean." Gallagher said he understood. Judge Fairfield adjourned the session. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and picked up my folder from the table. I didn't look at Sabrina. I didn't need to. Margaret touched my arm. "That was a good day," she said quietly. "Not done yet," I said. She nodded. "No, but a good day. Here is what happened in the months that followed, and I want to walk through it precisely because the details matter." The civil proceeding continued for 6 weeks after the initial hearing. At the second appearance, Gallagher withdrew 2 of the 3 original claims, the financial misconduct allegation and the asset concealment allegation. The undue influence claim was narrowed substantially and ultimately dismissed when Thomas Connolly testified and when the letter my grandfather had written was entered into the official record. The forensic accounting referral moved forward separately. The DA's office reviewed the materials Margaret had submitted and opened a formal inquiry. I want to be careful about what I say here. The process is ongoing, and I don't want to speak for outcomes that haven't been formally determined. What I will say is that the documentation was reviewed, the transfers were confirmed, and the inquiry established that the movements were systematic and deliberate. The civil divorce settlement was reached without going back to court. Sabrina's claims having been substantially undermined, Gallagher negotiated from a significantly weakened position. The $230,000 recovery was included in the settlement terms. The inherited assets, my grandfather's estate, the trust structure he'd so carefully constructed, remained entirely intact. The Vantage equity was assessed as premarital in origin and not subject to division. I left the marriage with what I'd come into it with, plus 14 years of work, plus my grandfather's legacy. Sabrina left with what the settlement entitled her to, minus $230,000, minus attorney's fees, minus the consequences of an inquiry that had been referred to people I had no control over. Derek Caulfield, I learned later from a mutual acquaintance, had moved to Austin, Texas, sometime in the spring. Sabrina had not moved with him. I'm going to tell you about the Sunday after the settlement was finalized. I drove to Weston, to my grandfather's house, which was now in the hands of the Preservation Trust. though I had been given lifetime visiting privileges as part of the trust structure. I had a key. I let myself in through the side door and walked through the house slowly. The study was exactly as he'd left it. His leather chair, the lamp he'd had since the 1970s, the shelves of books he'd read and annotated in pencil. The raised bed garden was visible through the study window, empty now and covered in the gray of late November. I sat in his chair. I am not a religious man in any formal sense, but I sat in that chair for about an hour, and I talked to my grandfather. I told him what had happened. I told him that everything he'd prepared had worked. I told him that the careful way he'd done things, the quiet, methodical, ahead-of-time way, had protected what he'd built. I told him I understood now why he'd said what he said about being a good judge of character. I told him I thought I was getting better at it. The house was completely silent. Outside, the November light was doing what it does in New England. Low and clean and honest, no sentiment in it at all. I watched the empty garden for a while, thought about tomatoes in paper bags in a diner on Mass Avenue and pie and stories about the first business deal. Thought about a letter in his handwriting, sitting in a court file in Suffolk County, telling a judge that he had chosen me because of what I'd shown him about my values. I don't know if that's what justice feels like. I don't know if there's a clean word for what it is to have the person you loved most in the world take care of you from beyond the end of his own life, with the same quiet thoroughness he applied to everything when he was alive. I know that I felt grateful, deeply, specifically personally grateful. Not for the money, not for the outcome of the hearing, for the evidence that I had been known, that someone had watched how I lived and made a judgment about it, that the person whose judgment I trusted most in the world had trusted me with his life's work. That's not something you can put a number on. That's not something a court can award or take away. That's just what it is to have been loved by someone who paid attention. My name is Julian Hartwell. I'm 43 years old. I am the CTO of a company I co-built from nothing, and the heir to a fortune I never expected, and the grandson of a man who drove a 12-year-old Volvo and grew tomatoes in paper bags and quietly outmaneuvered everyone who tried to diminish the people he loved. I sat in a courtroom in Boston in a gray suit on a November morning and watched a judge read a document my grandfather's attorney had prepared 6 weeks before his death. And I watched the other side of the room understand, slowly, then all at once, that they had walked in thinking they knew what kind of man I was. They never knew who I really was. They never understood what kind of people I came from. They do now.